There is a moment in every act of sheltering when the person doing the sheltering understands that they have crossed a line from which there is no returning. Not a dramatic line, not a line drawn in sand or blood or treaty language. A quiet line, interior, felt in the bones the way a change in atmospheric pressure is felt before the storm arrives. On one side of that line stands the version of yourself that could still walk away. On the other stands the version that has chosen, and the choosing is permanent, and the cost of it will be extracted from you in increments you cannot yet calculate. Ellara Voss understood this. She had understood it for 19 years, which was how long she had been running the last government-licensed human education post on Cauldre Station. 19 years of other people's children. 19 years of chalk dust and recycled air, and the particular silence of a classroom after the last student has gone home. She understood the mathematics of attachment, how it compounded, how the interest accrued in the small hours when a child's cough echoed through the partition wall, and her body moved toward the sound before her mind had finished sleeping. She was 61 years old. Her hair had gone the color of ash, cropped close to her skull in the practical style of someone who had stopped caring about vanity around the same year. She started caring about ventilation schedules and protein ration calculations for growing bodies. Her hands were square and capable, the knuckles swollen from years of writing on mineral compound boards in cold rooms, and there was a scar across her right palm from the time she had caught a falling heating element bare-handed, because a child was standing beneath it. She thought about that scar now. She thought about it because her hand was wrapped around the wrist of a Drivari child named Finn, and the child's pulse was hammering against her fingers like something trapped. "Quiet," Ellara said, not sharply, with the specific calibration of a voice that had spent 2 decades learning how to carry authority without carrying threat. "Breathe with me, in through the nose. Count 3. Finn's eyes vast, silver-gray, with pupils that dilated in rings rather than circles locked onto Ellara's face. The child's skin was the color of pale ash, smooth and cool to the touch, with a faint blue undertone that deepened when the child was distressed. Finn's ears, long and tapered to fine points, were pressed flat against the skull. The child was trembling. Behind them, muffled by 3 meters of reinforced stone and a blast door that Ellara had sealed 11 minutes ago, something detonated. The floor shuddered. Dust sifted from the ceiling and caught in the emergency light's amber cone. "Count 3, Ellara repeated. 1, 2, 3, now out slow." Finn breathed out. The trembling didn't stop, but the pulse under Ellara's fingers eased from frantic to merely fast, and the child's ears lifted a fraction from the skull, still flat, still pressed, but no longer sealed. There were 9 of them. 9 children in the shelter beneath the schoolhouse on Cauldre Station's lower deck, arranged in the configuration that Ellara had drilled into them over 6 months of what she had called weather practice, and what every child in the room understood to be preparation for exactly this. She released Finn's wrist and stood. She moved through the shelter with the efficiency of long rehearsal, checking each child in turn, touching a shoulder, meeting an eye, adjusting a blanket. The shelter was a repurposed storage bay, low-ceilinged, 15 meters by 8, with curved walls that had once held crated engine components and now held 9 sleeping mats, a water reclamation unit, a sealed food locker, a chemical toilet behind a privacy screen, and a battered communications console that Ellara had built from salvaged parts over the course of 3 years without telling anyone why. The children ranged in age from small to nearly adolescent. 7 Drivari, 1 Kethani, 1 Sarasi. The Kethani child, a boy named Pell, had mint-green skin and copper hair that fell across his face in unruly waves. He was the quietest. He sat in the far corner with his knees drawn up, and his hands clasped around a small carved figurine, a bird, whittled from station-grade polymer by Ellara during a long evening when the boy had not spoken for 4 consecutive days, and she had needed something to put in his hands. The Sarasi girl, Tavi, was the oldest. Tall for her kind, with deep indigo skin and white hair braided tight against her scalp and eyes like polished copper. She was standing by the blast door with her fists clenched, listening. Tavi had been on Caldris for 3 years. Before that she had been on a transport. Before that she had been somewhere she did not discuss, and the quality of her silence on the subject told Ellara everything the words would have. Miss Voss, Tavi's voice was low, that was closer. It was. The garrison. Probably. Tavi's jaw tightened. Her copper eyes cut to the younger children, then back to Ellara. How long? Ellara looked at the girl. Tavi was nearly adult by Sarasi standards, though her frame was still narrow, and her movements still carried the particular angularity of someone whose body hadn't finished deciding what shape it intended to be. She was old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to have understood it before Ellara did in some ways, because Tavi had grown up understanding it, and Ellara had merely learned. Long enough, Ellara said. It was not an answer. It was a placeholder, and Tavi knew it, and the look she gave Ellara said so. Another detonation, farther this time. The lights flickered but held. Ellara crossed to the communications console and keyed the receiver. Static hissed through the speaker, dense, layered, the kind that meant active jamming across the local spectrum. She adjusted the frequency, hunting for gaps. Found nothing. Adjusted again. A voice broke through, fragmented. All non-military personnel to sectors 9 through. Immediately. Repeat, Dominion forces have. Station perimeter is. The voice dissolved into static. Ellara switched the console off. She stood with her hands flat on its surface and closed her eyes. Behind her, 9 children waited. She had known this was coming. Not the specific day, not the specific hour, but the shape of it. She had known for 2 years, since the Caldris Dominion, the local military authority that administered the station's outer sectors, had begun its census operations among the refugee populations on the lower decks. Census operations that involved armed personnel entering refugee quarters at odd hours. Census operations that resulted in certain families being relocated to processing centers from which no verifiable communication ever emerged. Census operations that focused, with a precision that could not be coincidental, on children. The Dravari refugees had come to Caldris 7 years ago, fleeing the collapse of their homeworld's magnetosphere. They were a species that had evolved in low-gravity, high-radiation environments, and their biology reflected it. Dense bone structure, radiation-resistant skin, eyes adapted for dim light. They were also, Ellara had learned from a Dravari elder named Sarath, a species whose children carried in their marrow a compound that the Dominion's Weapons Development Division had identified as a potential catalyst for a new generation of directed energy systems. The children were not people to the Dominion, they were materiel. Ellara had learned this 18 months ago. Sarath had told her in the schoolroom after hours, speaking in the flat, exhausted tone of someone delivering information they no longer had the energy to feel. She had laid out the documents, intercepted communiques, requisition orders, transfer manifests that listed children by weight and bone density, rating rather than by name. Ellara remembered the moment with surgical clarity. She remembered the particular quality of the light in the schoolroom. The overhead panel on the left had been flickering, as it always did, casting a rhythmic pulse across the desks. She remembered the grain of the documents under her fingers. She remembered the weight that settled into her chest, not all at once but in layers, the way sediment settles in still water. She had looked at Sarath and said, "I need to build a shelter." Sarath had looked at her and said, "You are not Dravari." "No. This is not your obligation." "No. They will come for the children regardless. Then they'll come through me." It was not a heroic statement. Ellara did not traffic in heroics. It was a structural assessment, delivered in the same tone she used when explaining to a class why a particular equation balanced. This is the situation. These are the forces. This is what holds. She had built the shelter. 3 years of requisitioning materials under false pretenses, of spending her personal allotment on blast-rated composites, of learning demolition engineering from archived manuals, and teaching herself to weld in the maintenance tunnels after hours. She had built the communications console from components scavenged from decommissioned relay stations. She had stockpiled food and water in quantities that would sustain 9 children and 1 adult for 14 days. She had drilled the children, weather practice. When the alarm sounds, you go down the stairs. You take nothing except what is in your emergency pack. You sit in your assigned place. You breathe. Now the alarm had sounded. Not the weather alarm. She had installed the station's own collision klaxon, repurposed by the Dominion to signal a security lockdown. She had heard it through the schoolroom floor while the children were in afternoon session, and she had looked at them and she had said, "Weather practice. Now." They had gone, 7 minutes from classroom to shelter. Practiced and clean. That had been 2 hours ago. The detonations were not weather. Ellara opened her eyes. She turned from the console and surveyed the room. 9 faces. 9 sets of eyes watching her with the particular attentiveness of children who have learned that the adult in charge is the only fixed point in a shifting universe. "All right," she said. She kept her voice level. She had learned over 19 years that the architecture of calm was more important than the feeling of it. Children did not read internal states. They read structure. They read consistency. If the walls of the voice held, the walls of the world held. "We're going to be here for a while. Pell, bring me the ration box. Tavi, check the water level. Fen, you're on light maintenance. Make sure the backup cells are charged. Everyone else, Matt's out. We're going to do something useful." "What?" asked a small Drivari child named Asa, whose ears were the longest Ellara had ever seen on a child of that age, and who had a habit of asking exactly the question that was on everyone's mind. "Mathematics," Ellara said. 9 faces stared at her. "You heard me. Get your slates." There was a moment, a suspended, disbelieving moment, and then the children moved. Slates were retrieved from emergency packs. Mats were unrolled. Pell carried the ration box to the center of the room with the careful gravity of a child entrusted with a sacred object. Tavi checked the water reclamation unit and reported the level at 68%. Ellara pulled a stub of chalk from her pocket and crouched beside the nearest bare stretch of floor. She began writing an equation. Long division. The kind of thing that required concentration, that forced the mind to track one number at a time, that left no room for the sound of detonations or the question of what was happening above their heads. "Copy this," she said. "Work it through, show your process." The children copied. They worked. The scratch of chalk on slate filled the shelter, and for a span of minutes the world contracted to the size of a problem with a solvable answer. Ellara watched them work. She watched Asa's ears tilt forward in concentration. She watched Fenn's silver eyes narrow as the child tracked the carries. She watched Pell in his corner, set the carved bird on the floor beside his slate, and begin writing with slow, deliberate strokes. She remembered the first day Pell had come to her classroom, 3 years ago. He had been brought by a Kethani woman who was not his mother, a neighbor, someone who had taken him in after his parents had been among the first group relocated during the census operations. The woman had said, "He does not speak," and Ellara had said, "That's all right, he doesn't have to." And Pell had sat in the back row for 6 weeks without speaking, and Ellara had left chalk and a slate on his desk every morning, and one morning she had come in to find a drawing on the slate, a bird. Not a Kethani bird, not a species she recognized. A bird from the boy's imagination, detailed and precise and rendered with a steadiness of hand that told her the silence was not emptiness but containment. She had carved him the figurine that evening. She was not a skilled carver. The bird looked more like a lumpy fish with aspirations. But Pell had taken it in both hands and held it against his chest, and his mint-green skin had flushed a deeper shade. And from that day forward he had carried it everywhere. And from that day forward, Ellara had understood that she had crossed the line. Not the dramatic line, the other one, the quiet one, the one that rearranged your interior architecture so completely that you could not remember the floor plan of the person you had been before. A Drevari girl named Liz finished her equation first. She held up her slate with the quiet pride of a child who had solved something, and the solving had briefly made the world navigable. Liz was one of the middle children, not the smallest, not the oldest, occupying the invisible middle where children were old enough to understand danger but young enough to still believe an adult's competence could outweigh it. She had pale blue skin and ears that were slightly asymmetrical, the left one tilting a few degrees more than the right, giving her a permanent expression of quizzical attention. "Show me," Ellara said and crouched beside her. The equation was correct. More than correct. Liz had extended the division 3 places further than required, as though the act of solving had become its own comfort, and stopping meant returning to the room they were actually in. "Good," Ellara said. "Now try this one." She wrote a harder problem on the floor beside Liz's mat, 3-step, the kind that would take 15 minutes of focused work. Liz looked at the problem. She looked at Ellara. "Is this because you want me to learn, or because you want me to stop thinking about the sounds?" "Both," Ellara said. She had never lied to the children about her methods. Honesty was a structural material. You could not build with it exclusively, but without it the walls were hollow. Liz accepted this and began working. Across the shelter, Tavi had finished checking the water unit and was crouched by the blast door again, her ear pressed against the metal. The girl's posture was rigid, the coiled stillness of someone who had learned, long before arriving on Caldris, what it meant to listen for approaching danger. Ellara crossed to her. "Tavi." "I can hear them moving on the deck above. Coordinated, grid pattern, they're being systematic." "I know. They'll find the access point to this section within 3 hours if they maintain pace." Ellara had already calculated this. Hearing it confirmed by Tavi, who had her own experience with systematic searches, her own knowledge of how military grids worked, acquired from the place she did not discuss, tightened the timeline in Elara's chest. "I have a contingency for that," Ellara said. Tavi turned her copper eyes on Ellara. The look was not the uncertain hope of the younger children. It was the measured assessment of someone old enough to understand that contingencies could fail. "The maintenance conduits," Tavi said, "not a question. You've seen the maps. I saw you drawing them in the schoolroom, late, after you thought I'd gone home." A pause. "You always think I've gone home." Ellara looked at the girl. In this light, with the emergency amber cutting sharp angles across her indigo face, and her white braids pulled tight, and her jaw set like a bolt driven home, Tavi looked older than her years. She looked like someone who had decided what kind of person she was going to be, and was building toward it with the same methodical stubbornness that Ellara brought to shelter construction and lesson plans. "I'll need you at the front," Ellara said. "Can you do that?" "I've been at the front before." "I know, that's why I'm asking." Tavi held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, a single, sharp movement that carried the weight of a contract. Another detonation. Close. The emergency light swung on its housing and shadows lurched across the walls. Asa's chalk stopped moving. "Miss Voss, are they going to find us?" Ellara looked at the child. Asa was small even for a young Drevari, with ash-pale skin and silver hair that stuck up in every direction despite Elara's daily attempts to flatten it. The child's eyes were enormous and luminous, and held the particular quality of a creature that has learned to see in darkness. "The door is rated for concussive force up to Class 4, Ellara said. "The walls are reinforced composite bonded to the station's structural frame. The ventilation system is independent and filtered. The shelter is not on any station schematic. That's not what I asked. No, it wasn't. Children were precise that way. Ellara crouched in front of Asa. She put her square, scarred hands on the child's narrow shoulders and looked directly into those silver eyes. I built this room, she said. I built it with my own hands, and I tested every seal and I reinforced every joint. And I am inside it with you, and I am not going anywhere. Asa's ears lifted from their pressed position, not all the way, halfway. The ears of a child who wanted to believe and was deciding whether believing was safe. Finish your equation, Ellara said. Asa finished the equation. The hours passed. Ellara taught. She taught mathematics and then she taught stellar cartography, drawing constellations on the floor in chalk, naming the stars that were visible from Cauldre Station's observation ports. She taught the children a memory game that involved reciting sequences of numbers in ascending complexity. She taught Tavi a method for estimating structural load capacity, that the girl absorbed with the hungry focus of someone who intended to build things someday. Between lessons she checked the console, static, jamming once a fragment of voice, evacuate, repeat, all sectors, and then nothing. A Dravari boy named Kale, 7, by his size, though Ellara never asked ages, had been pressing his back against the wall with his knees drawn up, his ears flat, his eyes fixed on the blast door as though he expected it to open at any moment. His breathing had gone shallow. His blue undertone had deepened to nearly violet. Ellara crossed to him without hurrying. She sat down beside him, her back to the same wall, and pulled a slate from the stack. Kale, draw me a map. A map of what? The route from your family's quarters to the schoolroom. Every turn, every landmark. Include the water fountain near corridor 12, the one that makes the grinding noise. Kale looked at her. The instruction was absurd. They both knew it. But the absurdity was the point. It was a problem, specific and concrete, that required him to think about something other than the blast door. He took the slate. He began drawing. His ears lifted as he concentrated, and by the time he had reached the grinding water fountain his breathing had steadied and his skin had returned to its normal ash blue. Ellara watched him and thought about the 17 maps she had in her own pack. 17 routes through the station's maintenance systems, each one walked and timed and annotated. 17 contingency paths, because a teacher who built shelters was also a teacher who built exits, and exits required maps, and maps required the kind of methodical, unglamorous preparation that nobody noticed until the moment it saved a life. Between console checks, she fed the children. Ration bars broken into precise portions. Water measured in careful increments. She ate last and less, and when Tavi noticed and opened her mouth to comment, Ellara silenced her with a look that carried 19 years of practice. On the 4th hour, the blast door shuddered. Not a detonation, not a knock, a scraping metal against metal, rhythmic and deliberate. Someone was testing the door seals, running a tool along the frame, looking for hidden compartments, looking for weakness. Ellara was on her feet in a single motion. She turned to the children and pressed one finger to her lips. 9 small bodies went still. The chalk stopped. The breathing went shallow. Even the youngest understood. Silence was not a suggestion. Silence was survival. The scraping continued for 45 seconds. Ellara stood with her hand flat against the blast door, feeling the vibration of the tool against its surface. The vibration stopped. Boots on stone, 2 pairs, heavy, moving away. The sound receded down the corridor above them and faded. Ellara exhaled. She did not let the children see the exhale. She turned back to the room and said, "Where were we?" Stellar cartography. Fen named the 3 brightest stars visible from port 7. Fen named them. The lesson continued. The architecture held. Between feedings and lessons, Ellara remembered. She remembered the first time the Dominion had come to the school. 4 soldiers in gray tactical armor, carrying data tablets loaded with census questions. They had stood in her classroom and looked at her children, though she had no legal claim to any of them, no biological connection, no species kinship, and they had asked for names and ages and medical histories. And Ellara had provided names and ages and medical histories that were accurate in every particular except the bone density ratings, which she had adjusted downward by a factor of 3. Because she had read the requisition orders, and she knew what high bone density ratings meant to the Weapons Development Division. She remembered the soldier who had looked at her, young for a Dominion officer. Human, which made it worse, because Ellara understood human faces and could read in his the particular discomfort of a person carrying out an order they knew to be wrong and had chosen to follow anyway. He had looked at the children sitting in their rows, chalk in their hands, equations on their slates, and something in his face had shifted a fracture, hairline quickly sealed, and he had taken the falsified records and left. He had come back, twice. The second time he had stood in the doorway after the other soldiers had moved on and said, without looking at her, "The next census will include physical examinations." Ellara had looked at him. When? Soon. How soon? He had not answered. He had walked away, and Ellara had understood that the timeline had contracted, and the shelter was not yet finished, and she had 14 ventilation seals left to install. She had installed them in 9 days. She had not slept well during those 9 days, or during many of the days after, but she had slept enough, because she was a woman who understood efficiency, and guilt-driven insomnia was inefficient, and the children needed her functional. Now she sat in the shelter she had built and listened to the detonations grow intermittent and then stop, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound, because sound carried information and silence carried only the weight of not knowing. The children slept. Not all of them. Tavi sat by the door, awake, her copper eyes fixed on the metal. Pell was awake too, his carved bird pressed against his chest, his green eyes open and watchful. But the younger ones slept, curled on their mats in the configurations that children adopt when the ground beneath them is uncertain. Tight, small, limbs tucked, bodies arranged so that a hand or a foot touched the nearest other body, maintaining contact even in sleep. Ellara sat with her back against the wall and her hands in her lap, and thought about walls. She had built many walls in her life, not physical ones though the shelter qualified, walls of curriculum, walls of routine, walls of the daily, repetitive, unglamorous work of showing up for children who were not hers in a place that was not home, day after day, until the showing up itself became a kind of architecture, a structure that the children could lean against, could push against, could test the strength of and find holding. She thought about the first wall she had built, 23 years ago, on a colony world called Verath, where she had taken her first teaching post at a frontier school serving the children of miners and freight workers. She had been 38. She had come to teaching late, after a career in structural engineering that had ended when the company she worked for had been contracted to build detention facilities for a colonial administration, whose methods she had not been able to reconcile with her capacity to sleep at night. She had quit. She had retrained. She had stood in front of a classroom of dirty-faced children on a mining world and discovered that the skills transferred: load assessment, stress distribution, understanding where the weak points were and reinforcing them before they failed. Children were structures. They needed foundations poured correctly. They needed load-bearing walls positioned where the weight would fall. They needed someone who understood that the invisible work, the work beneath the surface, the work that no one saw or thanked you for, was the work that kept the building standing. She had been good at it. Not inspired, not charismatic, not the kind of teacher who appeared in memoirs as a transformative figure. The kind of teacher who showed up, who marked papers until midnight, who learned enough xenobiology to understand why a Dravari child's attention span collapsed after 30 minutes of artificial light and restructured her lesson plans accordingly, who figured out that Kethani children processed grief through their hands and needed to be given something to hold a tool, a block, a carving before they could sit still long enough to learn, who discovered that Sarasi adolescents stored trust in a different part of the brain than younger children did, and that earning it required not warmth but consistency. The same voice, the same expectations, the same presence, day after day, until the pattern itself became a kind of proof. On Varath she had taught a boy named Karo whose father had been killed in a shaft collapse. The boy had stopped speaking for 6 months. Ellara had left chalk and a slate on his desk every morning, and he had drawn machines, elaborate, impossible machines with gears and pistons and wings. And eventually he had spoken again, and the first thing he said was, "Miss Voss, this gear ratio is wrong," pointing at her physics diagram, and he had been correct. She had looked at him and felt something shift in the architecture of her life, a wall moving into a weight-bearing position it would never leave. She had left Varath when the colony's educational funding was cut and the school was closed. She had gone to 3 other postings after that: a freight hub, a border station, a refugee transit camp, and each one had ended the same way. The funding dried up, or the administration changed, or the political winds shifted, and the school was closed and the teacher moved on. But the children she had taught stayed in her memory like load-bearing walls in a structure she could not stop building. And by the time she reached Caldris, she had understood that the building was her life and the walls were the children, and the foundation was the simple, unsexy decision to show up. Who carved ugly birds for silent children and falsified bone-density records, and built shelters in maintenance tunnels because someone had to, and she was positioned where the load fell. The comm crackled, not static this time, 3 short bursts of prearranged signal. Ellara was at the console in 2 strides. She keyed the receiver. "Sareth, I'm at corridor 19. I need the door." Ellara checked the external camera, a pinhole lens, invisible from the outside, feeding to a small screen mounted beside the intercom. The image was grainy but clear. Sareth, the Dravari elder, standing alone in the maintenance corridor. Gray-skinned, gaunt, her long ears folded back in exhaustion. Blood on her sleeve, though whether it was her own was impossible to determine from the image. Behind her, the corridor was empty. Ellara unsealed the door. Sareth entered and Ellara sealed it behind her. The elder's eyes swept the shelter, counted the children, registered the sleeping mats, the ration supplies, the communications console, the chalk equations on the floor. Her gaze lingered on the equations. "You are teaching them," Sareth said. "They need something to do." Sareth looked at Ellara. The elder's face was mapped with lines that traced years of evacuation, of displacement, of watching a species scatter and rebuild and scatter again. Her eyes were dark gray, nearly black, and held the particular weight of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding that the galaxy did not owe you a place in it and would not apologize for the absence. "The Dominion has taken the upper decks," Sareth said. "The garrison resisted for 90 minutes before they were overrun. The refugee sectors are under lockdown. They are conducting door-to-door searches. For the children. For all of us, but especially for the children. They have a new device, a portable marrow scanner. They don't need to draw blood anymore. They hold it against the child's arm, and the density reading comes up on a tablet in 3 seconds. The specificity of the detail hit Ellara like a physical blow. 3 seconds. They had reduced the process of identifying which children to take to a 3-second scan. Efficient. The word sat in her chest like something with edges. "How many did they find?" Sareth's jaw tightened. 3 families did not reach shelter in time. 11 children. The number settled into the room. 11. 11 children weighed and measured and entered into a requisition manifest. 11 children whose names would be replaced by density ratings. Ellara's hand closed around the edge of the console. Her knuckles went white. She held the grip for 3 seconds, the same 3 seconds it took to scan a child's arm, then released it. What's their search pattern? Systematic, deck by deck, corridor by corridor. They're using thermal scanners on the walls, checking for hidden spaces. The shelter walls are insulated. Against standard thermal, yes. Against military-grade penetrating scans. Sarath paused. I don't know, but I know they've brought military-grade equipment. I saw it being unloaded. Ellara nodded. She had built the walls to withstand standard scanning. Military-grade was another matter. She had not been able to source the materials for that level of shielding without triggering procurement flags. How long before they reach this section? 6 hours, perhaps less. They've split into 4 teams. The team covering the lower decks has a Kethani tracker, thermal sense specialist, good at finding hidden spaces. A Kethani tracker. Ellara filed the information. A thermal sense specialist would read the residual heat signatures of bodies against the walls, even through insulation. If the insulation had been in place for less than, she ran the calculation, less than about 5 hours. The shelter had been occupied for 6. The signatures would be fading but still detectable. She looked at the sleeping children. She looked at Tavi, who was listening to every word with the focused intensity of a person already running calculations. She looked at Pell in his corner, the carved bird clutched in both hands, his green eyes fixed on Sarath's bloodied sleeve. Then we move, Ellara said. Where? The maintenance conduits beneath Deck 7 run to the eastern docking arm. I mapped them last year. You mapped maintenance conduits. I map everything. Sarath stared at her. The look contained something that Ellara had seen before in the faces of parents who discovered the extent of what she had done, the shelter, the false records, the contingency routes. It was not gratitude. It was closer to bewilderment. The bewilderment of someone encountering a force they had not accounted for. A human woman, 61 years old, with chalk dust in the creases of her knuckles, and a scar on her palm, and a set of priorities that did not bend. You are not Dravari, Sarath said again, the same words she had spoken 18 months ago. No. Why do you do this? Ellara considered the question. She had considered it many times in the small hours, in the spaces between lesson plans and ventilation seal installations. The honest answer was complicated. The honest answer involved a colony world and detention facilities and the specific moment when she had looked at a blueprint and understood what she was building and who would be housed inside it. The honest answer involved 23 years of teaching other people's children and discovering that the capacity to care was not a fixed quantity but an expanding one, that it grew with use rather than depleting, that every child she taught became a load-bearing wall in a structure she hadn't known she was building. But Sarath had asked the short version. Because they need someone in the room who doesn't leave, Ellara said, and I'm in the room. She woke the children. She woke them the way she always woke them, touching a shoulder, speaking a name, giving each one a moment to surface before the next demand arrived. She told them they were moving. She told them to pack their emergency kits. She told them to stay close and stay quiet and follow Tavi, who would be at the front of the line, while Ellara would be at the back. Where are we going? Asa asked. Somewhere safer. Is anywhere safer? Yes, Ellara said. With a certainty she manufactured from the same material, she manufactured lesson plans and shelter walls. Necessity. They moved through the maintenance conduits in single file. Ellara had walked these routes alone, at night, with a hand-drawn map and a headlamp, memorizing the turns, the junctions, the access panels. She had noted which sections had functioning lights and which were dark. She had tested the air quality in each stretch. She had, in the most literal sense, done her homework. Tavi led. The girl moved with the silent, alert gait of someone who had learned to walk without sound in a previous life and had not unlearned it. Behind her came the younger children, each one gripping the sleeve or the pack strap of the child in front. Pell was in the middle of the line, his carved bird tucked inside his shirt. Finn was behind Pell, the child's silver eyes catching the dim conduit lights and throwing them back like small mirrors. Sareth walked beside the youngest children, one hand on Asa's shoulder. Ellara brought up the rear. She walked backward at intervals, checking the corridor behind them. She carried no weapon. She had never carried a weapon. She did not oppose violence on principle. She was not a pacifist, and she had seen enough of the galaxy to know that pacifism was a luxury available to people who had not been positioned where the load fell. She simply did not carry a weapon because her hands were full of other things: chalk, ration bars, ventilation seals, the wrists of frightened children. There was a limit to what you could hold. They moved through the conduits for 20 minutes without incident. The air was stale and metallic. Once, a distant detonation rumbled through the station's superstructure, and the children froze as one, and Ellara counted 3 heartbeats of silence before touching Finn's shoulder to restart the line. At the junction where Conduit 7 branched into 3 sub-corridors, Tavi stopped. She held up one hand, the signal Ellara had taught her. Voices above them, not distant this time, close. The conduit ran directly beneath a main corridor. The ceiling was thin composite, not sound-insulated, not designed for concealment. Through it, Ellara could hear boots, 2 pairs, and a voice speaking in the clipped cadence of military communication. Check sections 4 through 9. Negative. Moving to lower maintenance access. The tracker reads residual signatures below Deck 7. Below Deck 7. They were in Deck 7's conduit. Elara's hand closed on Finn's shoulder. She looked ahead at Tavi and made a single gesture right. The right branch. The one that angled away from the main corridor, toward the station's waste processing infrastructure, where the ambient heat from the recyclers would mask biological thermal signatures. Tavi moved. The children followed. They moved faster now, the urgency transmitted through the line like current through a wire. Asa's short legs worked double time. Kale's breathing went shallow again, and Sareth tightened her grip on his shoulder. They reached the right branch. The conduit narrowed. The walls were warmer here, the waste processors on the deck above radiated heat downward, and the air carried a faint chemical tang. Ellara herded the children into the narrow space and pressed them against the warm wall. "Still," she whispered. "Completely still." The sound of boots continued overhead. Paused. Something scraped a hatch being tested. Ellara looked up at the conduit ceiling and calculated. The maintenance access hatch was 15 meters behind them at the junction. If the soldiers opened it, they would look down into an empty junction. The children were around the corner, out of direct line of sight. If the soldiers came down into the conduit, that calculus changed. Silence 10 seconds, 20. The boots moved on, the voices faded. Ellara waited 60 seconds longer before she let the children breathe. In the darkness of the conduit, Pell's hand found hers. Small, cool, the mint-green skin smooth against her calloused palm. He gripped her fingers with the desperate strength of a child, who had learned that hands could be taken away, and was holding on against the taking. She squeezed back. She held on, and she thought about the 23 years of walls she had built, and how all of them, every curriculum, every lesson plan, every ventilation seal and blast-rated composite panel had been leading to this. Standing in a warm conduit with a child's hand in hers and soldiers on the deck above, and the absolute, bone-deep refusal to let go. They moved on. 5 minutes later, Kale stopped. The boy's breathing had gone wrong again, short, rapid, his blue undertone deepening toward violet. He was staring at a section of conduit wall where moisture had condensed and dripped in a pattern that, in the dim emergency lighting, looked like a smear of something darker. Ellara moved up the line to him. She did not kneel, the conduit was too low. She crouched beside him and blocked his view of the wall with her body. Kale, the map you drew earlier. How many turns between your family's quarters and the schoolroom? The boy blinked. 7. Name them. Left at the water fountain, right at the recycler junction, straight through corridor 14. He named them all. By the time he reached the 7th turn, his breathing had settled and his color had eased. Ellara touched his shoulder and they moved on. Behind her, she heard Sareth murmur something in Drevari too low to catch the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the tone of someone watching a thing they had not thought possible. A human woman who had learned the rhythms of Drevari children's nervous systems well enough to interrupt a panic spiral with a map-drawing exercise, and who did it without ceremony, without pause. The way a mechanic adjusts a component, not because it was remarkable, but because it was the next thing that needed doing. Another 20 minutes through conduits that grew progressively more industrial, less maintained, pipe junctions, cable bundles. A section where the flooring was grated metal, and the children's footsteps rang like small bells, and Ellara made them stop and remove their shoes and carry them until the grating ended. They reached the junction point, where the maintenance conduit intersected with the eastern docking arm service passage. Ellara checked the access panel sealed, but she had the override code, because she had spent an evening 18 months ago learning the station's access code architecture from a retired systems engineer who owed her a favor for tutoring his grandson. The panel opened. Beyond it, the service passage stretched toward the docking arm's secondary airlock, where if the Dominion's search pattern held, there would be no soldiers for another 4 hours. Through here, Ellara said. Quickly. The children filed through, Tavi first, then the line, then Sareth. Ellara came last, sealing the panel behind her. The service passage was wider, cleaner, and lit by emergency strips that cast everything in pale blue. The children's faces, already drawn with exhaustion and the effort of sustained silence, looked spectral in the light. Asa's silver hair glowed. Fenn's ash skin took on a ghostly blue cast. Tavi's indigo skin darkened to near black, and her copper eyes caught the blue light and burned. They reached the secondary airlock. Ellara paused to count heads, a reflex so ingrained that she did it without thinking, the same automatic census she performed every morning in the schoolroom and every evening at dismissal. 9 children, 1 elder, all present, all upright, all breathing. She checked the docking arms manifest on a wall-mounted terminal. 1 ship registered, a Varanthi cargo hauler, cleared for departure in 6 hours, bound for the neutral station at Hollow's Gate. 6 hours, not ideal, but time could be used, and Ellara was a woman who used time the way an engineer used material, nothing wasted, every minute load-bearing. The docking arm had maintenance bays, small, unregistered, used by dock workers for equipment storage. Ellara knew where 3 of them were. She had walked this arm. She had mapped it. She had because she was a woman who built things from necessity and lived inside the structures she built, prepared for this exact scenario. She led the children to the nearest maintenance bay. Inside, crates, welding equipment, the smell of coolant and metal. She cleared a space, laid out mats from the emergency kits, distributed rations and water. Rest, she said, we're safe for now. For now, Tavi repeated, not challenging, noting. For now is what we have, so we use it. The children rested. Some slept. Some lay on their mats and stared at the ceiling with the open-eyed stillness of creatures whose nervous systems had not yet received the signal that danger had passed. Ellara sat by the bay door and kept watch. Sareth sat beside her. The cargo hauler, Sareth said quietly, it's Captain. I know him, Dren Vasari. He's transported refugees before. He's human. Yes. Will he take them? He'll take them. How can you be certain? Ellara thought about Dren Vasari. She thought about the last time she had spoken to him, 6 months ago, when he had docked at Caldress for a routine cargo exchange, and she had approached him in the loading bay and explained, in the same flat, structural language she used for everything, what the Dominion was doing on the lower decks. She thought about the way his face had changed, not the dramatic shift of outrage, but the quiet, tectonic settling of a person absorbing information that rearranged their internal landscape. He had said, "What do you need?" She had said, "A way out. When the time comes." He had said, "You'll have it." "Because I asked him," Ellara told Sareth, "and he's the kind of person who answers." The hours crawled. Ellara did not sleep. She checked the corridor at intervals, stepping out into the service passage and standing in the pale blue light listening. The station hummed around her, the deep, constant vibration of a structure keeping itself alive. Overlaid on that hum, if she held still long enough, she could hear other things. Distant boots, the whine of a scanner, once the muffled crack of a door being forced open on a deck far above. She went back in. She taught Pell a finger-counting game that required no speech, and the boy played it with solemn concentration, his green eyes tracking her fingers as they moved through the sequences. She taught Asa to calculate the volume of a cylinder, because Asa's mind needed feeding the way her body needed water, and a fed mind was a mind that had less room for the sound of boots and the scrape of tools against blast doors. Liz drew on the floor of the maintenance bay. The child had exhausted her mathematics and turned to cartography, not the stars Ellara had taught them but the station itself, rendered from memory in careful chalk lines. Corridors, junctions, the school, the market on level 4 where Liz's aunt sold fabric. Ellara watched the map take shape and recognized in it the same impulse that had driven her own mapping. The need to understand the terrain, to hold the world's geometry in your hands. Because a world you could draw was a world you could navigate, and a world you could navigate was a world that had not yet defeated you. She monitored the wall terminal for updates. The Dominion's communication net had expanded. She could see new nodes appearing on the terminal's network display, each one representing a scanner unit or a patrol team. The grid was tightening. What had been 4 search teams was now 6. They were moving faster, having found nothing in the upper decks worth their time, concentrating their resources downward, toward the refugee levels, toward the school. At the 90-minute mark, the terminal registered something that made Ellara's hands go still on the console, a flag on the school's administrative records. Someone had accessed her personnel file. Her name, her posting history, her quarters assignment. The flag was tagged with a Dominion intelligence code that Ellara did not recognize but whose placement attached to her file, not the schools, not the students, told her that the Dominion had stopped looking for children in general and had started looking for the specific person who might have hidden them. At the second hour, a child named Vess 6, Drivari, the smallest of them all, so quiet that Ellara sometimes had to actively remember to check on her, began to shake. Not the trembling of fear, but the deep, involuntary shuddering that Drivari children experience when their nervous systems reached overload. The child's ash-pale skin flushed dark blue, and her eyes went wide and fixed, and her hands clenched and unclenched in rhythmic spasms. Ellara was beside her in 2 strides. She knelt, lowering herself, making herself small, positioning her body between Vess and the rest of the room so the other children couldn't see the full extent of it. "Vess, look at me, just at me." The child's silver eyes found her face. The shuddering continued. Ellara took both of Vess's hands in hers and held them still. She began counting. Not the breathing exercise. Vess was past that. A different kind of counting. A game Ellara had invented for exactly this situation, because in 19 years of teaching she had learned that some children needed their minds occupied so completely that the body could not maintain its panic. "I'm going to say a number," Ellara said, her voice low and steady, "and you're going to tell me whether it divides evenly by 3. Ready? 42. Vess blinked. The absurdity of the question cut through the overload the way nothing else could. "Yes," she whispered. 17. "No." 99. The shuddering eased. "Yes." 204. A pause, the child's brow furrowed, her hand stilled in Ellara's grip. "Yes." 68. "Good." 513. 171. "Yes." The shuddering stopped. Vess's skin faded from dark blue to its normal ash pale. Her hands relaxed. She looked at Ellara with the expression of a child who has been pulled back from an edge and doesn't yet understand how. Ellara released her hands and smoothed the child's silver hair, a gesture she had not planned, that came from somewhere older than planning. "Good work," she said. "Rest." At the 4th hour, the maintenance bay door opened and a man stepped through. Human, 50 maybe, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, a nose broken and reset slightly off-center, eyebrows like iron filings, a jaw that suggested opinions. He wore a freight captain's coveralls stained with engine grease and carried a datapad in one hand and a thermos in the other. Dren Vasari looked at the maintenance bay. He looked at the 9 children on their mats. He looked at Sarath. He looked at Ellara. "You called it," he said. "I planned for it." "Same thing with you." He crouched in the doorway, staying low, keeping his voice under the hum of the ventilation system. "Patrol shuttles at the far end of the arm. They're doing visual inspections, cargo manifests, crew checks. They'll reach my berth in about 90 minutes. The crawlway. Measured it last month like you asked. It'll hold 9 small bodies and 2 adults. Tight, but breathable. I rigged a secondary air feed from the cargo ventilation system. It won't show on environmental scans. Temperature masking. The aft cargo section runs warm. Coolant line for the primary drive runs right along the crawlway wall. Anything biological in there reads as engine bleed on a standard scan. Ellara nodded. "When can we move?" "Now. Better now, before the patrol reaches the midpoint and the cameras sweep this section." Ellara stood. She turned to the children. 9 faces looked up at her. 9 sets of eyes, silver, copper, green, dark gray, in a spectrum of alien skin tones, in the pale blue light of an emergency strip in a maintenance bay on a station that had decided they were materiel rather than people. "We're going to a ship," she said. "Captain Vasari's ship. It's going to take us somewhere safe." "Safe for real?" Asa asked the same question. The child's ears were fully upright now, pointed at Ellara like antennae tuning to a frequency. "Or safe for now." Ellara looked at the child with the silver hair and the luminous eyes, and the habit of asking the question that cut through every wall. "Safe for real," she said, and meant it and did not know if it was true and said it anyway because that was what a wall did. It held whether or not it believed in its own capacity to hold. They moved. Through the service passage into the docking arm proper, past sealed cargo bays and maintenance access points. Vasari led, his stride unhurried, his body language broadcasting the easy confidence of a captain walking his own dock. Tavi followed, then the line of children, then Sarath, then Ellara. At the 3rd cargo bay, Vasari stopped. He held up his hand, the line froze. Ahead at the intersection where the docking arm met the main concourse, 2 Dominion soldiers stood at a checkpoint that had not been there an hour ago. Gray armor, sidearms, a portable scanning station. Vasari turned and walked back to Ellara. His expression had not changed, the same unhurried competence, but his eyes were different. Harder. "Checkpoint, they've locked down the docking arm." Ellara's mind worked the problem. Service hatch, Bay 4. It drops to the maintenance level and comes up inside the cargo loading zone on the other side of the checkpoint. "You know this because I walked it 8 months ago." The hatch is behind a false panel marked Atmospheric Systems. "I left a pry bar on the lip." Vasari looked at her. "You left a pry bar?" I left pry bars in 11 locations across the station. Of course you did. They doubled back. Bay 4's service hatch was where Ellara said it would be. The pry bar was where she had left it. Vasari worked the hatch open with the efficient motions of a man who had spent his life opening things that other people's systems wanted to keep closed. The children descended one by one into the narrow maintenance channel beneath the docking arms floor. Ellara counted each one down. Asa first, the small child, dropped into the channel and immediately began counting steps, a coping mechanism Ellara recognized because she had taught it to her 8 months ago during a power outage that had plunged the school into darkness for 45 minutes. Fen next, silver eyes throwing back the dim light. Kale, his map folded in his pocket, his breathing steady now. Lis, Ves, the other Dravari children, each one moving with the practiced smallness of creatures who had learned to take up less space than they occupied. Pell hesitated at the hatch. He looked down into the dark channel, and his green eyes went wide, and his grip on the carved bird tightened until his mint-green knuckles paled. "What's in there?" he whispered. It was the first sentence he had spoken in 3 years, and the words came out rough and thin, like something pulled from storage after long disuse. Ellara filed it not because it was remarkable, but because it was progress, and progress was a structural material that you tracked and built on. "Metal and air and a way out," she said, "same as every conduit I've ever walked." He looked at her. Then he looked at the bird in his hands. Then he tucked the bird inside his shirt, against his ribs, and lowered himself into the channel. The channel smelled of coolant and machine oil. The children moved through it in single file, bent nearly double, their hands against the walls for balance. Sareth guided the youngest from behind, her gray hands steady on their shoulders. Tavi was already at the far end, her white braids swinging as she checked the exit point, with the methodical attention of someone who had internalized every contingency lesson Ellara had ever taught. Halfway through, the channel passed directly beneath the checkpoint. Through the thin floor plating above them, Ellara could hear the soldiers' voices, bored, professional, discussing a shift change. One of them laughed. The sound traveled through the metal and into the channel, and every child went still. Ellara touched Fen's shoulder, held, waited. The voices continued mundane, operational, oblivious. 30 seconds, a minute. The conversation shifted to a cargo inspection, and the soldiers' footsteps moved away. Ellara released Fen's shoulder, and the line moved on. They emerged into the cargo loading zone through a floor grating that Vasari shouldered open. The hauler's berth was 20 meters ahead. The ship sat on its landing cradle, squat and functional, its ramp lowered. Vasari went first. He checked the hold, checked the corridor, checked the approach. All clear, he waved them in. The cargo hold was cavernous and half full of crated agricultural equipment. Vasari led them past the crates to the aft bulkhead, where an access panel opened onto the maintenance crawlway. It was narrow, low-ceilinged. The children filed in one by one, arranging themselves in the tight space with the practiced efficiency of creatures accustomed to making themselves small. Pell went in last among the children, his carved bird clutched against his chest, his green eyes finding Ellara's face and holding on. Sareth entered. She turned in the crawlway and looked back at Ellara. Ellara did not enter. She stood at the access panel and looked at the crawlway. 9 children, 1 elder, packed into a space that had been measured for exactly this purpose, and she ran the calculation one final time. Weight, space, air, 9 children, 1 elder, 1 human woman whose body mass would reduce the available oxygen by a margin she had already computed and found unacceptable for the transit to Hollow's Gate. Ellara, Sareth said. The inspection, Ellara said. If they scan the crew and find 1 more human aboard than the manifest accounts for, they'll search the ship. If they search the ship, they'll find the crawlway. The patrol is 90 minutes out. There isn't time to forge a crew addendum. You planned for this. I planned for every contingency. This one requires that I not be on the ship when it's inspected. Sareth's face did not change. The elder had spent a lifetime maintaining composure in the face of information that demanded its collapse. But her dark eyes held something that was not composure, something rawer, something that lived beneath the surface of a woman who had already lost too much to lose this too. You will stay, Sareth said. I'll stay on the station. Vasari will dock at Hollow's Gate. There's a Drevari diaspora community there. I've been in contact with them for 4 months. They'll be waiting. The transit papers are pre-filed under a humanitarian exemption clause that I found in the Neutral Systems Compact, Article 37, subsection 9. You found a legal clause. I'm a teacher, Sareth. Research is what I do. The elder looked at her. The look held for a long time. Then Sareth reached out and took Ellara's hand in both of hers, four-fingered, gray, cool, and held it. The Drevari gesture for a debt that transcended language. They will look for you, Sareth said. Yes. There will be consequences. There are always consequences. The question is who bears them. She gently freed her hand. She looked past Sareth into the crawlway, where 9 faces looked back at her. Asa, with the silver hair and the ears and the questions. Finn, with the mercury eyes and the pulse that hammered when the detonations came. Kale, with his map of the school corridors still folded in his pocket. Vess, who could divide by 3 faster than the panic could take her. Liss, who drew maps of the station because a world you could draw was a world that had not yet defeated you. Tavi with the copper eyes and the clenched fists and the plans. And Pell in his corner of the narrow space, his carved bird in his hands, his green eyes enormous and still. She had crossed the line 19 years ago. She had crossed it again 18 months ago, when she had started building the shelter. She had crossed it every morning when she walked into the schoolroom and picked up the chalk and looked at the children and began. Crossing the line was not a single act. It was a practice. It was the daily, unglamorous, invisible work of showing up for the load that had fallen on you and holding it and holding it and holding it. I'll be fine, she said, and smiled because the architecture of calm required it, and because 19 years of practice had made the smile structurally sound even when the foundation beneath it was shaking. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the chalk stub. She held it out to Tavi. Keep teaching them, she said. Mathematics every day, cartography twice a week. Make Asa do her equations, she'll try to skip the long division. Make sure Pell has something to hold. Tavi took the chalk. The girl's copper eyes were bright and wet and furious, which was Tavi's version of every emotion too large to fit in a single word. Miss Voss. Go, the ramp closes in 4 minutes. Ellara sealed the access panel. She stood with her hand flat against the metal and listened to the muffled sounds of the children settling into the crawlway. She stood there until the sound stilled, and then she stood there a moment longer, her palm against the warm metal, feeling the vibration of the ship's life support systems cycling through the hull. Then she turned and walked out of the cargo hold and down the ramp and onto the dock. Vasari was at the base of the ramp. He looked at her. You could fit, he said. The math doesn't work. Sometimes math is wrong. Not my math. Vasari looked at her for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. She took it. His grip was calloused and firm and held the particular pressure of a person sealing a contract they both understood. Hollow's Gate, he said. 14 days. I'll send word when they're settled. 14 days. He walked up the ramp. It closed. Ellara stood on the dock and watched the cargo hauler system cycle through pre-departure checks. She stood there when the Dominion patrol shuttle reached the berth, and 2 soldiers descended and inspected the ship's manifest and cargo hold and found nothing crated agricultural equipment, a 3-person crew, standard documentation, and waved it through. She stood there when the docking clamps released, and the hauler lifted from the berth and angled toward the station's departure corridor, its engines throwing a faint blue wash across the dock plating. She stood there until the ship was gone. Then she put her hands in her pockets and walked back into the station's corridors, toward the maintenance conduits, toward the access panels and the shelter, and the schoolroom above it, where the chalk was still on the board and the desks were still in their rows, and the equation from the last lesson was still unfinished on the overhead display. She would be found. She knew this. The Dominion would complete their search. They would find the schoolteacher with the falsified records and the unauthorized shelter and the missing children. They would find the shelter itself, the 3 years of work, the blastrated composites, the communications console built from salvaged parts. They would find the maps. They would find the 11 hidden pry bars, or most of them. They would find the falsified bone density reports and trace them back to her terminal and her login credentials, because she had not tried to hide the trail. Hiding the trail would have required erasing the records entirely, and erasing the records would have left the children with no medical history at all. And a child without a medical history was a child whose Cathani allergies or Dravari light sensitivity protocols would be unknown to whoever treated them next. She had kept the records, she had kept the trail. She had, in the particular calculus of a woman who built things, chosen to be the component that absorbed the stress so that the rest of the structure could hold. There would be questions. There would be a detention facility, perhaps one built by a company like the one she had worked for 23 years ago, before she understood what she was building. The irony was structural, and she had accounted for it. But the children were on the ship. The children were in the crawlway with the secondary air feed and the emergency rations and the carved bird and the chalk stub. The children were moving toward Hollow's Gate, where people who were not Ellara would take them in and shelter them and teach them, and the transit papers were filed under Article 37, subsection 9, and the diaspora community was waiting, and her math was right. Ellara Voss walked through the empty corridors of a station that had decided children were materiel. She walked past the sealed doors and the checkpoint barriers. At the intersection near docking arm 3, she passed 2 soldiers in gray armor who were checking identification. One of them looked at her, a woman, 61, ash-haired, wearing a teacher's smock with chalk dust on the cuffs. He glanced at her station badge, Education Division, Lower DECKS. "Ma'am, the lower decks are under lockdown. You shouldn't be in this section." "I was checking on a supply order at the dock commissary," Ellara said. Her voice was level, the architecture of calm. "Ration supplements for the school. The children eat twice a day and the protein allocation hasn't been adjusted since the last quarter." The soldier looked at her. He was young, human. He had the particular expression of a person who had been told to look for threats and was standing in front of a woman who looked like a schoolteacher because she was one. "I'll need to see your authorization." She produced it. She had carried the commissary authorization in her smock pocket for 6 months, updated quarterly, stamped with the Education Division seal. It was legitimate. It was also her cover for being in the docking arm, and she had renewed it 3 days ago because she was a woman who prepared for contingencies the way other people prepared for weather. The soldier scanned it, handed it back, and waved her through. Ellara walked on. Her heart rate was elevated. She could feel it in her temples, in the pulse of the scar on her palm, but her stride did not change, and her hands did not shake, and the walls held. She walked past the market level, sealed now, the stalls dark behind their shutters, past the residential corridors where the Dravari families had lived, some doors still open, some marked with the Dominion's yellow search complete tags, past the school. She stopped at the school. The door was open, the lights were on. Inside, the classroom looked exactly as she had left it. Desks in rows, slates stacked on the supply shelf, the equation from the last lesson still on the overhead display. Her desk, with its neat stack of graded work. The drawer where she kept the extra chalk. The window, not a real window. A display panel showing a feed from the station's external cameras that looked out onto the star field, and that she left on during lessons because children needed to see the sky, even an artificial one, especially when the walls were close. She stepped inside. She picked up a piece of chalk from the desk drawer. She stood at the board and looked at the unfinished equation and after a moment completed it. The answer was 42. She wrote it in her clear, precise hand and underlined it twice, the way she always underlined answers, so the children would know which number was the one that mattered. Then she sat down at her desk and folded her hands and waited for whatever came next, because that was what a teacher did. You showed up. You did the work. You stayed in the room. The corridor outside was quiet. The station hummed. The stars turned on the display panel. And somewhere ahead of that turning, a ship carried 9 children toward a place where people were waiting, and the chalk was in Tavi's hand, and the bird was in Pell's, and the equations would continue. She did not look back. She did not need to. She had built the walls, and the walls were holding, and the children were inside them, moving toward a place where someone would catch them when they arrived. And that was enough. In the crawlway, 14 hours into the transit, Pell spoke. It was the second time. The other children were asleep, packed tight in the narrow space, the hum of the ship's engines a constant vibration beneath them. Tavi was awake, the chalk stub in her hand, a half-finished equation scratched onto the crawlway's metal wall. Pell said she stayed. Tavi looked at him. The boy's green eyes were open and clear, and held the particular light of someone who had been silent for a very long time and had chosen this word, out of all possible words, as the one worth breaking silence for. Yes, Tavi said. She always stays. Tavi closed her hand around the chalk. She thought about the schoolroom and the shelter and the equations on the floor, and the woman who had built all of it with her square, scarred hands, and then stood on a dock and watched them go, and did not get on the ship because the math did not work, and she was a woman who built with certainty rather than hope. Yes, Tavi said. She does. Pell pressed the carved bird against his chest and closed his eyes, and the ship carried them through the dark toward a place where someone would be waiting, because Ellara Voss had measured the distance and sent word and planned the lesson all the way to its end, the way she planned everything. With care, with precision, with the quiet, immovable stubbornness of a woman who understood that the invisible work was the work that mattered, and that the greatest thing a person could build was a door that opened outward toward safety for someone smaller than themselves. The ship flew on, the stars turned, and behind them, on a station that did not deserve her, a teacher sat at her desk with chalk dust on her hands and an answer on the board, and the walls she had built were holding.